I never thought the bond with my younger brother, Ethan, would lead to something that would shatter everything I believed about family. That weekend, left alone in the house, something changed between us. A line was crossed, emotions unraveled, and I found myself questioning everything. It wasn't just a slip, it was something far deeper, far more dangerous. How did it come to this? And could we ever go back? Ethan and I always had a special bond. As siblings with a 5-year age gap, I had practically raised him while our parents worked long hours. Growing up, he was the carefree younger brother, always eager for my attention, while I took on the role of his protector. I helped him with school projects, bandaged his scraped knees, and stood up for him when others tried to push him around. To me, he wasn't just my brother. He was a part of my identity. But as time passed, life took us on different paths. I left for college, and the closeness we once shared was replaced by the occasional text or family holiday. Ethan was left at home, navigating high school on his own, while I was busy carving out my life in the city. I often felt a pang of guilt for not being there, but I told myself he'd be fine. He was resilient, after all. When our parents asked me to stay with Ethan for the weekend while they attended a business retreat, I agreed without hesitation. It felt like a chance to reconnect, to bridge the gap that years of separation had created. When I arrived, Ethan greeted me at the door with his usual grin, teasing me about how long it had been since I'd visited. I laughed it off, but inside I felt the weight of those lost moments. That evening, we slipped back into a familiar rhythm. We shared dinner, caught up on life, and even watched one of our favorite childhood movies. For a while it felt like nothing had changed. But as the night went on, I began noticing things I hadn't before. How much he'd grown, how mature he'd become. It was a jarring realization, one that left me unsettled. Ethan wasn't the little boy I used to protect anymore. He was taller, more self-assured, and had an air of confidence that caught me off guard. It was like seeing him through a completely different lens, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. I brushed it off as nostalgia, a longing for the days when life felt simpler. But deep down, I knew this weekend wasn't going to be like any other. The weekend started off as planned, calm and uneventful. Ethan and I quickly settled into a routine, spending the days reminiscing about old times and laughing over shared memories. It felt good to be around him again, to slip back into the role of his older sister. But the more time we spent together, the more I began to notice subtle shifts in our interactions. Ethan wasn't just catching up with me, he was observing me. His gaze would linger a second too long, and I often caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Maybe he was just glad to have someone around after spending so much time alone. But as the hours passed, those fleeting glances became harder to ignore. It wasn't just his behavior that stood out. There was something different about the energy between us. When we sat on the couch watching another one of our favorite comedies, his presence felt closer than usual. Our legs brushed more often than I remembered, and every time they did, I'd feel an inexplicable tension ripple through the air. I told myself it was nothing, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Later that evening, while cleaning up after dinner, Ethan seemed quieter than usual. I asked him if something was wrong, and he simply shrugged it off with a faint smile. "I'm just tired," he said, avoiding eye contact. But there was a vulnerability in his voice that I hadn't heard before. I wanted to push further, to ask what was really bothering him, but something held me back. As the night grew darker, the tension between us became almost palpable. We decided to watch another movie to wind down. Ethan scrolled through the options, eventually landing on a thriller we both liked. As the scenes played out on screen, I found it increasingly difficult to focus. Ethan sat closer than before, his arm brushing mine each time he shifted. The subtle touches weren't deliberate, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. When the movie ended, Ethan turned to me and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you miss being here?" he said, his voice soft. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But things are different now. I like having my own space." "I get that," he said, leaning back against the couch. "But it's weird not having you around. The house feels empty." There was a sadness in his tone that tugged at something deep inside me. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I didn't know how. Instead, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm here now," I said. "And I always will be." Ethan's eyes met mine, and for a moment the room felt still. The warmth of his gaze made my chest tighten, and I quickly withdrew my hand, suddenly overwhelmed by the moment. "It's getting late," I said, forcing a laugh. "We should probably get some sleep." He nodded, standing up and stretching. "Good night, Laura," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night," I replied, watching as he walked upstairs. As I sat there alone in the living room, my thoughts spiraled. I tried to rationalize the unease I felt, telling myself it was just the strangeness of being back home. But deep down, I knew something had changed, something I couldn't quite name. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee drifting through the house. Groggy but curious, I made my way to the kitchen, where Ethan stood at the stove, humming softly to himself as he cooked breakfast. The sight of him, so comfortable and confident, caught me off guard. For a fleeting moment, he didn't feel like the younger brother I'd grown up with. He felt different. "Morning," he said, flashing me a grin when he noticed me lingering in the doorway. "I made eggs. Hope you're hungry." "Thanks," I replied, sitting down at the table. He set a plate in front of me, and we ate in companionable silence. It felt normal, but the undercurrent of tension from the night before hadn't fully disappeared. Every time our eyes met, I felt a flutter of something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to name. After breakfast, Ethan suggested going for a walk. "It's been forever since I've been to the park," he said, his voice light but his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea, but eventually agreed. Maybe some fresh air would help clear my head. The park was quiet, just as I remembered it. We strolled along the familiar paths, talking about nothing and everything. For a while it felt easy, like we'd slipped back into the carefree sibling dynamic of our childhood. But as we reached the swings, a wave of nostalgia washed over us. "Remember how you used to push me on these?" Ethan said, sitting down on one of the swings. His legs were too long now, his feet almost touching the ground. "You always made sure I didn't fall." "Of course," I replied, smiling faintly. "That was my job." He looked at me, his expression soft but serious. "You've always looked out for me, even when things were tough." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The way he was looking at me made my chest tighten, and I found myself averting my gaze. "That's what siblings do," I said lightly, trying to defuse the moment. "Maybe," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it always felt like more than that with you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but found that I couldn't. My thoughts were a tangled mess, and I didn't know how to make sense of the feelings that had been bubbling under the surface since the weekend began. The walk back to the house was filled with an awkward silence. Ethan stayed close to me, his shoulder occasionally brushing against mine. Each touch sent a spark of something through me, something I couldn't ignore but desperately wanted to. That evening, the tension reached a boiling point. We decided to play video games to pass the time, falling into our usual banter and competitive teasing. For a while, it felt like the strange energy between us had dissipated. But as the night wore on, it became clear that wasn't the case. Ethan's laughter would linger just a second too long, his hand brushing against mine when he passed me the controller. I tried to focus on the game, but my thoughts were scattered, my emotions tangled in ways I didn't understand. When the game ended, Ethan turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Laura," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" My heart skipped a beat. "Of course," I replied, setting the controller down. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know how to say this, but this weekend has been different. Being around you again, it's made me realize things I didn't understand before." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" He shook his head, as if frustrated with himself. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. I care about you more than I should." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stared at him, struggling to process what he was saying. "Ethan, we're siblings," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't right." "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't help it. You're the one person who's always been there for me, the one person who truly gets me. And I don't know how to turn these feelings off." I stood up abruptly, pacing the room as I tried to gather my thoughts. "Ethan, it's complicated. We can't." "I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted. "I just needed to tell you." I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I didn't know how. The tension between us was almost unbearable, the air in the room heavy with unspoken emotions. "Ethan," I said finally, turning to face him. "We need to set boundaries. This isn't something we can let take over." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "I understand," he said softly. "But I needed you to know. As the night wore on, the weight of our conversation lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, one that we could never uncross. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. That night, the house was unnervingly quiet. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts swirling in a relentless storm. Ethan's words replayed in my mind, each one heavy with a meaning I wasn't ready to confront. I told myself over and over that we could move past this, that it was just a fleeting moment of vulnerability. But the truth was harder to swallow. Something between us had shifted, and no amount of rationalization could change that. Around midnight, a faint knock at my door shattered the silence. My chest tightened as I sat up, instinctively glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for casual conversation. "Laura." Ethan's voice was soft, hesitant. I hesitated, torn between ignoring him and letting him in. "Yeah." I finally replied, my voice unsteady. "Can I come in?" he asked. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's late, Ethan." "I know," he said quickly. I need to talk to you." Something in his voice made it impossible to turn him away. "Okay," I said softly. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. He looked vulnerable, his shoulders slumped and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before crossing the room to sit at the edge of the bed. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "I don't know how to act normal around you anymore." "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off. "I know what I said earlier made things weird," he said quickly. "And I'm sorry. But I can't stop thinking about it. About you." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and impossible to ignore. I stared at him, my pulse racing. "Ethan, we've already talked about this. We're siblings. Whatever you're feeling, it's not wrong to feel," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I know this isn't normal, but I can't pretend it doesn't exist." I stood up abruptly, pacing the room as I tried to gather my thoughts. "You're confused," I said, my voice shaking. "We've been through a lot together, and that's bound to create a strong bond. But this isn't right." "I'm not confused," he said, standing as well. "I've never been more sure of anything. You're the one person who's always been there for me, who's seen me for who I really am. How can that be wrong?" I turned to face him, my chest tight with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Because it is, Ethan. It's wrong because we're family." He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Family doesn't change how I feel. And I know you feel it too." His words hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and tell him he was wrong. But the truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and terrifying. There was something between us, something I didn't have the strength to name. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't." "We already have," he said, his voice breaking. "It's there, Laura. We can't pretend it isn't." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This will ruin us." "It doesn't have to," he said softly, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was gentle, but it felt like a spark igniting a fire that had been smoldering for days. "We're the only ones who can decide what this means." For a moment, I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of his words, his touch, his presence, it was all too much. And yet, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Slowly, he leaned in, his gaze searching mine for any sign of rejection. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull back and end this before it went any further. But my body betrayed me, and before I knew it, our lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, filled with uncertainty and hesitation. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, becoming something neither of us could deny. It was wrong, and we both knew it. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing else mattered. When we finally pulled apart, the room was filled with a heavy silence. Ethan's eyes searched mine, his expression a mix of fear and hope. "Laura," he said, his voice barely audible. I stepped back, my hands trembling. "We can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "This is a mistake." "Was it?" he asked, his tone steady. "Because it didn't feel like one." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, my mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. "You should go," I said finally, my voice strained. Ethan hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "But this isn't over." When the door clicked shut behind him, I collapsed onto the bed, my chest heaving with suppressed sobs. What had I done? How had we gotten to this point? And how could we ever go back? The next morning was quiet, the atmosphere in the house heavy with unspoken words. Ethan avoided me, and I didn't have the strength to seek him out. It was as if we were both trying to pretend the night before hadn't happened, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. By the time our parents returned, I was desperate to leave. I packed my things quickly, barely saying goodbye as I headed for the door. Ethan followed me outside, his expression unreadable. "Laura," he said, his voice soft. "Please don't shut me out." "I need time," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to figure this out." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sadness. "I'll be here when you're ready." As I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, I couldn't stop the tears from streaming down my face. What had started as a simple weekend visit had spiraled into something I never could have anticipated. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces of a bond that had been irreparably changed. The days following my departure were a blur of conflicted emotions. I threw myself into work, desperate for a distraction, but my mind kept circling back to Ethan. I replayed our conversations, his words, the kiss. Each memory brought a fresh wave of guilt and confusion. I tried to convince myself that it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting mistake we could both move past. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Ethan texted me a few times during the week, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I stared at his messages for hours, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, unable to find the right words. "I'm sorry" felt inadequate. "I need space" sounded too cold. So I said nothing, hoping the silence would speak for itself. But silence didn't erase what had happened. If anything, it made the weight of it even heavier. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without feeling like I was suffocating under the enormity of what we'd done. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his vulnerability, his desperation, his hope. And every time, it shattered me all over again. A week after I'd left, Ethan called. I hesitated, my heart racing as his name flashed across the screen. Ignoring it felt cruel, but answering felt impossible. The phone rang out, and a minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before pressing play. "Hey Laura. I just wanted to check on you. I know things are weird right now, but I miss you. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to. Please, just call me when you can." "Okay." His voice was soft, hesitant, filled with the same raw vulnerability I'd heard that night. It broke me in ways I didn't know I could be broken. For the first time since I'd left, I allowed myself to cry. Not the silent tears I'd been shedding in the dead of night, but deep, guttural sobs that left me gasping for air. The following weekend, I finally mustered the courage to text him back. I kept it simple, clinical. "I'm okay. I just need some time. Please understand." His reply came almost immediately. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." His words should have comforted me, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. I didn't know what I needed, didn't know how to make sense of the mess we'd created. All I knew was that our relationship, whatever it was, could never go back to the way it had been. For weeks, I avoided going home. I made excuses to my parents, claiming I was too busy with work or that I wasn't feeling well. The thought of facing Ethan, of confronting the tension that still lingered between us, was too much to bear. But avoiding him didn't make the feelings go away. If anything, it made them stronger. Every time I thought of him, I felt a strange mix of longing and dread, a pull I couldn't explain but couldn't deny. It was wrong, I knew that, but it was real. And that terrified me. Eventually, my parents insisted on a family dinner. I couldn't say no without raising suspicion, so I reluctantly agreed. As I pulled into the driveway that evening, my stomach churned with anxiety. The house looked the same as always, but it felt different, like the air around it was heavier, charged with unspoken truths. Ethan greeted me at the door, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "Hey," I replied, avoiding his gaze as I walked past him. Dinner was awkward, at least for me. My parents chatted happily, oblivious to the tension between Ethan and me. He was quiet but composed, his demeanor calm and collected. It was almost maddening how normal he seemed, as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I could barely focus on the conversation, my thoughts a chaotic mess. After dinner, my parents retired to the living room, leaving Ethan and me to clean up. The silence between us was deafening as we washed dishes side by side. Finally, he broke it. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the sink. "Yeah, you." He hesitated before replying. "Not really." His honesty caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him. The vulnerability in his expression mirrored my own, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "But I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. We'll figure it out. Will we? He asked, his tone tinged with doubt. Because it feels like you're avoiding me. Like you're trying to forget. I'm not trying to forget, I said quickly. I don't know how to handle this. Neither do I, he said, his gaze holding mine. But ignoring it isn't going to help. He was right, of course, but that didn't make it any easier. The weight of our shared guilt, our forbidden connection, was too much to confront head-on. But as I stood there, looking into his eyes, I realized that avoidance wasn't a solution. If we were ever going to move forward, we needed to face the truth, together. We'll figure it out, I repeated more firmly this time. But it's going to take time. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. Okay, I can live with that. As I left that night, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since that fateful weekend, it felt like we were on the same page, however uncertain that page might be. The road ahead was still unclear, but at least we were willing to walk it together. And for now, that was enough. The weeks following our tentative reconciliation were a slow, unsteady journey toward normalcy. Ethan and I both knew that the bond we shared would never fully return to what it once was, but we were determined to find a way forward. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope, every shared moment tinged with unspoken emotions. But we kept trying, because giving up wasn't an option. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd put off for far too long. At first, I didn't know how to begin explaining the tangled mess of guilt and confusion I felt. But as the sessions went on, I began to unpack the layers of my relationship with Ethan. The responsibility I'd taken on as his protector, the emotional gaps left by our absent parents, and how those factors had blurred the lines between us. Through therapy, I realized that my own emotions were just as complex and conflicted as his. I didn't hate him for what happened. I didn't even blame him. Instead, I saw a person who had grown up too fast, searching for love and understanding in the only person who had consistently been there for him. And I saw myself, someone who had unknowingly carried the weight of being his emotional anchor for years. It was a dynamic that had been brewing long before that weekend, but it had taken a moment of weakness to bring it to the surface. Ethan and I eventually talked about everything. Really talked, without the tension or defensiveness that had clouded our earlier conversations. We sat in the living room one evening, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the walls, and laid everything bare. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I just didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. I know, I replied. And I didn't handle it well either. I should have been more open about how I was feeling instead of shutting you out. We both apologized, not just for what had happened, but for the years of unspoken expectations and emotional dependencies that had led us there. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same side, not as siblings struggling to redefine their relationship, but as two people committed to healing. In time, things began to settle. Ethan focused on his plans for college, and I found solace in creating new routines and boundaries that allowed me to reclaim my own sense of self. We didn't talk about the kiss again, not because we were avoiding it, but because we both understood that rehashing it wouldn't help. It was a part of our story, yes, but it didn't define who we were. Looking back, I realized that the experience, as painful and complicated as it was, had taught me invaluable lessons about love, boundaries, and forgiveness. Love, even when misplaced, is rarely black and white. It's messy, nuanced, and shaped by the experiences and emotions we carry with us. Boundaries, no matter how difficult to enforce, are essential to maintaining healthy relationships. And forgiveness, both for others and for oneself, is the key to moving forward. I also came to understand that healing isn't a linear process. There were days when the memories would creep back in, when the weight of what happened felt almost unbearable. But those moments became fewer and farther between, replaced by a growing sense of peace and acceptance. Ethan and I eventually found a new rhythm. We weren't as close as we once were, but that was okay. Our relationship had evolved, and so had we. The scars left by that weekend were still there, but they no longer defined us. They were just a reminder of where we'd been and how far we'd come. As I sat in my apartment one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, I found myself filled with a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, for the chance to rebuild, and for the knowledge that even the most complicated relationships can find a way to heal. What would you have done in my situation? Could our bond have been repaired, or was it destined to remain fractured forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of relationships, love, and forgiveness. There's so much more to come, and you won't want to miss what's next.